Statistics show that one of the biggest problems that most people have with religious people is their hypocrisy. And this corresponds with one of my favorite groups of people to read about in Jesus' time who were also seen as hypocrites, the Pharisees. Now, I've always found the Pharisees described in the Bible to be super interesting. And one of the reasons why is because I can't think of a better parallel with them and what's wrong with so many religious people today, including a lot of self-proclaimed Christians. Now, I've been thinking about the Pharisees for years now, but it wasn't until recently that I started thinking about how the world is absolutely filled with non-religious Pharisees as well. Each day I see more and more secular Pharisees, agnostic Pharisees, and even atheist Pharisees. Now, if that sounds crazy to you, or if you don't know much about the Pharisees, don't worry, we'll be covering all of that today. So, are you curious what a secular Pharisee looks like? Well, let's get right into it. Meme team, you guys ready? Then let's go! Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about modern day non-religious Pharisees and what they look like. But first, let's start with the religious ones, so that way we make sure that we're all on the same page here. So now, Jesus told a parable. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you I'm not like those other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, and even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give a tenth of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all those who humble themselves will be exalted. The Pharisees were seen as a religious sect in Jesus' day who was really adamant about morality. And to put it simply, they believed that holding to the laws of the Old Testament and being exceptionally moral is how a person gets into heaven or has everlasting life. It's the classic view of religion that you basically find in religions today. The good and obedient people get into heaven, and the rest don't. So now, in the eyes of the people of their day, the Pharisees were seen as some of the most moral people in their society, and people considered them a great moral example, and they were widely recognized as great religious leaders. And then Jesus came along. So you might have expected for Jesus to come and join their ranks and spend all his time with them since they were well off in the religious elite of the day, but that isn't what happened. Instead, Jesus was seen hanging out with the poor, the disabled, the prostitutes, the sinners, and the other social outcasts of the day. And now at this time, there was a lot of prejudice towards different ethnicities and cultures, and some of the cultures were seen as unclean and evil. And guess what? Jesus was found hanging out with them too. And in that culture, eating and publicly associating with people held a lot of significance. So now, of course, when the Pharisees saw this, they saw it as an obvious indicator that Jesus was of the devil and that it wasn't possible for him to really be of God. So they didn't really seem to be too fond of Jesus, but you might expect for Jesus to be really fond of them because after all, we'd probably expect for Jesus to have congratulated them on their moral lives or at minimum their strong efforts in living such honorable lives. But that isn't what happened either. Jesus ran into them on occasion, and let's just say that he didn't share the same admiration for their moral performance that the other people of the day seemed to. He saw them as prideful hypocrites who were overly concerned with publicly showing off how good and moral they thought they were, while at the same time hypocritically telling people to live up to standards that they secretly could not live up to either. Jesus would run into them from time to time, and he even got into heated arguments with them. Now, he called them out to their faces and called them hypocrites and whitewashed tombs, and those were extremely harsh words for that time. And he consistently exposed them to onlookers and even to themselves for what they really were. Now, he did this by telling them that they weren't as perfect as they thought they were, and how they too didn't hold up to the same standards that they held everyone else to. So why was Jesus so insistent in trying to reveal to them how imperfect they were? Well, the reason why is because if you consider how moral they considered themselves to be, it would have been incredibly hard for them to see their own faults. So now put yourselves in their position. If you think that you have to be an exceptionally moral person in order to get into heaven, and you're working extremely hard to keep the rules every day so that way you know you get into heaven, how could you possibly even admit to yourself just how much of a moral failure you are? So one of the problems with the Pharisees is that they wouldn't have allowed themselves or anyone else to see their faults. And of course, without seeing their faults, they wouldn't be able to realize their need for a savior. They convinced themselves that they were good enough as they were. And this meant that instead of seeing the similarities between themselves and the most immoral people in their society, they worked really hard at only seeing the differences. They were in the same position as the prostitutes and the sinners, but the only difference was the prostitutes and the sinners weren't in denial about their moral failings. This is probably one of the reasons why Jesus spent so much time with those who were considered the most immoral in that society. At least with them, they knew they weren't perfect and that they needed a savior. So they were the ones who were humble enough to listen to Jesus. The religious Pharisees, on the other hand, were the ones who didn't even see their own need for a savior because in their eyes, they were fine as they were. They weren't humble enough to realize that they too needed someone else to save them. Now, here's why this is significant. Jesus and the authors in the New Testament spent a whole lot of time trying to get people to realize their need for a savior so that way Jesus could save them. Now, think about what Jesus did at the Sermon on the Mount. He pointed out to people that just because they haven't physically committed adultery, it didn't mean that they were morally perfect. He told them that if they even looked at a woman with lust, then they've committed adultery in their hearts. This turned their teachings against them. It showed them that if not committing adultery was one of the standards needed in order to get into heaven, then they would still be disqualified from heaven by the same standards that they gave others. And there's several other places where Jesus and Paul warned that you'll be judged by the same standards that you used to judge others by. And this is how you can condemn yourself by your own moral standards, because you can't even live up to them, whether you know it or not. If you don't believe me, well, there's an old illustration that goes something like this. Imagine that you were recorded every single time that you told someone that they shouldn't do something that you consider to be immoral. And it captured every single moment that you got morally outraged for something that someone did and when you said how they shouldn't have done something. Now, let's say that at the end of your life, you meet God and you're awaiting judgment. And God pulls out this recorder and tells you that he's not going to judge you based off of some set of moral standards that you didn't agree with while you were on earth. Nah. Instead, he'll only judge you by your own moral standards, the moral standards that you believed in, those same moral standards that you consider to be fair. With the recorder in his hand, he presses play, and you both sit there watching the recordings of you every single time that you made a moral claim. And he starts writing them all down on a list, and he says that he's going to hold you accountable to the principle behind the claims that you made. So now, maybe in different ways you said things like, you shouldn't tell others how to live their lives, or you shouldn't be selfish, or you shouldn't hurt other people's feelings, or you shouldn't talk down to people, or whatever it is. And so you know the list would be super long. So God gives you this list, and he holds you accountable to it. So now, how do you think that you did? Well, the truth is, none of us would hold up to our own list. We would all condemn ourselves by even our own standards. But now, let's talk about the non-religious Pharisees. So what do the modern day non-religious Pharisees look like? Well, like the religious ones, they see themselves as moral people and also don't think that there's anything wrong with how they live their lives. They too are in denial about their moral hangups and don't realize that they're judging people by standards that they can't even live up to themselves. And like the religious Pharisees they despise, they feel morally superior to religious people and look down on them with the same condescension that they've received from religious people. And unlike the prostitutes and sinners who were humble enough to realize that they were moral failures and needed a savior to save them from their own standards, the non-religious Pharisees are under the same delusion as the religious ones. They think that they're better than they are, and therefore they don't realize that they also need a savior. But according to the scriptures, it's only those who are humbled enough to know their need for a savior that can be saved. So just like the religious Pharisees who thought that they were living up to the moral standards that they condemned others by, the non-religious Pharisees are guilty of doing the same thing without even realizing it. They accuse religious people of being judgmental, condescending, closed-minded, and intolerant, acting as if they have the moral high ground and so on, while they remain completely unaware that they're doing the exact same thing. So it doesn't matter who we are. We'll all stand before God to be judged by a set of standards that will inevitably condemn us. So that's it. Good night and good luck to all of you on the day of judgment. Take care. Okay, wait. Actually, come to think about it, there is one way that I know of that you can fulfill the standards. The way is only found in the message of the gospel. So the message of the gospel is that God took on human flesh and entered into our world by making himself weak and vulnerable to all of the injustice and violence that we created. And he came into our world, lived a perfect life, and suffered and died unjustly at the hands of his own creation. So here's what this means for you. Instead of you having to stand before God and be held accountable to your own standards that you made on the tape recorder, he says that he'll trade you. Instead of you getting what you deserve, he took on the punishment and condemnation for you, so that way you won't have to get what you deserve. And since he lived a perfect life, instead of him getting what he deserved, no punishment and no condemnation, he says that he'll give that to you as a free gift because he loves you. So in other words, you can choose to stand before God based off of the life that you lived and be condemned by your own rules or standards, or you can simply accept his free gift of the life that he lived, and you can stand before God as if you fulfilled the standards of perfection perfectly. So now to close, let's revisit the parable once again, but let's change the characters and stuff a little bit just to illustrate how this could apply to non-religious Pharisees today. Two men went up to the mountain to meditate, one a non-religious Pharisee and the other an admitted moral failure. The non-religious Pharisee stood by himself and thought, I'm so glad I'm not like those other people, intolerant, selfish, moral hypocrites, and even like this person next to me who will tell you how selfish he is. I stand up for justice and donate some of my tax money to charity. But the person who considered himself a moral failure stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his chest and said, God, have mercy on me, a moral failure. I can't even live up to my own standards. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. The person who considered himself a moral failure was humble enough to see his need for God and humble enough to cry out to God for mercy. And so now I hope it makes sense why Christ ended this by saying, "For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." So that's the video. I hope you guys got something from it. Let me know what you think. Do you find yourself thinking like a religious or a non-religious Pharisee? And be honest. Let me know down below, and the next time that you find yourself thinking like one, what are you gonna say?
All I gotta say is,
what do you mean?